And it's so I'll just repeat that. So it's called Demystifying Schizophrenia, Cultural Interpretations Across the World. And so a few housekeeping things. This session is being recorded, and your cameras and mics will be turned off during the presentation. And at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A time. And everyone is welcome to send us confidential questions to the chat. Just make sure that the drop-down option lists Arturo, who's I believe he's listed as the host. And please don't share any personal or confidential information about yourself or others. Additionally, diagnoses cannot be made. And we will send this presentation to everyone after it's live. So I want to give a visual description of myself, and then I'll talk about the vocal cat warning. So I'm a sort of light medium skin Mexican trans guy. I have short dark brown hair. I have dark brown eyes. I wear glasses with a silver frame, and the bottom of them are frameless. I have brown headphones with silver accents. I'm also wearing a dark gray t-shirt with a gray shirt on top of it, and in front of a gray couch and a light gray wall. There's a lot of gray today. So you might hear or see my cat named Booger. He's normally very fluffy, but he got shaved this summer, so he's not as fluffy. But he's a very vocal cat. And yeah, so I wanted to get that out of the way. So we're going to do the neighborhood house land acknowledgement. And neighborhood house recognizes that we are on Indigenous lands, specifically the lands of Coast Salish people. We offer acknowledgement to our Coast Salish relatives and cultures, including the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Snoqualmie, the Muckleshoot, and the many other Lushootseed speaking communities and people. We recognize that we serve communities on lands governed by the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, a treaty that has not been fully honored. Neighborhood House also recognizes that we serve Indigenous people who are in King County due to forced relocation from their traditional homelands, and that many of our resources come from sources that have created inequities for Indigenous people. So you can learn more at native-land.ca. So this is our agenda for today. First, we're going to have a brief overview of schizophrenia. Then we're going to talk about the effects of culture, location, and migration. And then we'll talk a little bit about the applicability to neighborhood house. So I want to take a page from a mental health first aid training that I went to prior to the pandemic here at Neighborhood House, and ask folks in the room to take a moment and think of what comes to your mind when you think of schizophrenia, when you hear that word. And you can make a mental note, you can jot it down, or you can even send it to Arturo in the chat. So yeah, just take a few.
Hey, Vince, sorry to interrupt. It looks like your mic is going in and out, fading a little bit.
Okay.
Just if you can come closer to the mic or something to support that, it'd be great.
Yeah. How about, let's see, if I take my headphones off, is that better?
Well, let's try that.
Okay.
Let's see if it works. Thanks.
All right. Is this better? All right, we'll keep going. So yeah, if folks could just take a little bit to think about that. And now we're going to go over a little bit about schizophrenia. So, okay, I saw a thumbs up. That's good. So roughly it affects about 1% of the population. So schizophrenia is a severe and chronic mental disorder. You might also hear it labeled as a serious mental illness or SMI, and it affects about 20 million people worldwide. So even though it's about 1% of the population, it's still a good chunk of people. So it affects perception, it affects functioning, how somebody relates to their external world, how they relate to their internal world, their cognition. It can affect factors such as housing stability, employment, that sort of thing. And at the end of the talk, I'll have a bit.ly link where you can go and access more information, such as fact sheets and that sort of thing. So going back to that earlier exercise, chances are that what some of you thought of when you thought of the word schizophrenia, it's psychosis. So psychosis is a component of schizophrenia. And what it involves is essentially a detachment from reality. So this can include hallucinations. So oftentimes seeing things, hearing things that aren't there, but it can also be smelling, tasting, and feeling things that aren't there. It can be delusions, um, such as what are called quote unquote bizarre delusions, meaning given our understanding of the world, they're not happening. So like thoughts being broadcasted and other people reading minds essentially. And then there's also, sorry, those are bizarre. So, and then there's also non-bizarre, meaning they might happen, and they have happened. So if somebody thinking that the CIA is spying on them, that may actually happen. So, like I said, psychosis is a component of schizophrenia, but it's not the whole thing. And in fact, psychosis can be seen in a lot of other mental health disorders. It can be seen in mood disorders, personality disorders, drug-induced states. It can be seen in some medical conditions. So, like hallucinations can happen in epilepsy. So, different components can happen. Additionally, not all hallucinations are a symptom of like a mental health condition. So, for example, uh, think about a hallucination that you may have had while you're falling asleep or waking up. That's actually quite normal of an experience. So, schizophrenia, it has two components. So, what I described psychosis is considered a positive symptom. So, this includes that hallucination, those delusions, also odd behaviors that are not culturally appropriate, and sort of disorganization. And another part, and really a hallmark of schizophrenia, and also schizoaffective, which has similar domains, which has the same domains as schizophrenia, is the negative symptoms. So positive symptoms, think of those as experiences that normally don't happen, happening. So hallucinations, paranoia, etc. Negative symptoms are experiences that normally happen, but are not happening in schizophrenia. So this is that deep loss of motivation, that loss of emotional expression in their tone of voice, in their facial expressions, in how they respond to like interactions. They might give very one-word answers. They may withdraw from society. There's also cognitive functioning issues. So this can impact keeping employment. It can impact maintaining an education, like keeping in school. It can also impact just grocery shopping, taking medications. It can impact a lot of different things. And so that's sort of schizophrenia and how we see it sort of worldwide. We see these things pop up. We see those hallucinations, we see those symptoms. And schizophrenia, the term itself, is actually not that old. Actually, it was coined in 1908. And for context, Neighborhood House was founded in 1906. Prior to that, it was called dementia praecox. And prior to that, arguably, there are some historical accounts of schizophrenia, like odd behaviors and hallucinations, going as far back as 2000 BC across the world. So some people argue it's a modern disorder. Some people argue it's been there all along. We just haven't labeled it. But one thing that we do know about schizophrenia is that it's a culture-bound disorder, meaning where somebody is and what culture they belong in is really going to dictate a lot of their experiences. So additionally, migration also has an impact in this. And additionally, because of that cultural component, religion and spirituality can have an impact as well. So I'm going to touch on some cultures that we see here in Neighborhood House and how those might be different. So this includes East Africa, Middle East, Micronesia, Southeast Asia, Mexico and Central America, Eastern Europe, US indigenous tribes, and schizophrenia in the US. So when thinking about the impact of culture on schizophrenia, the point that I really want to drive home is this. If an adolescent, because schizophrenia typically develops around adolescence or early adulthood, depending on the sex assigned at birth. If an adolescent is starting to experience those symptoms, maybe they're starting to experience some hallucinations, where they are geographically and what culture they belong in is largely going to determine how they relate to their illness, their outcomes overall. And so take, for example, an adolescent who is having those hallucinations in a culture where schizophrenia is seen as a spiritual phenomenon, where the voices, like for example, in India and in some parts of Africa, where the voices are the voices of loved ones who have died, the voices of spirits, of guides, and they're oftentimes quite friendly. So take that experience where it's viewed as not a medical issue, not a brain disease, but rather a spiritual phenomena, and compare it to an adolescent who's in King County, just an hour north of Western State Hospital, which is one of the largest state-run psychiatric hospitals west of the Mississippi. It's an 800-bed facility where most people have schizophrenia, at least in the civil side. So that experience, just between those two adolescents who are just having hallucinations, it's going to be different. In the person in King County, those voices, research has shown that in the United States, voices tend to be really mean. They tend to say really, really horrible things. They're hostile. They are not friendly. Versus those voices in another country, such as a country in Africa, it may be a spiritual connection. It may be a loved one who passed. So just think about the relationship to those voices. And in the United States, we have a lot of stigma around schizophrenia. For example, I grew up watching crime shows. I love crime shows, but how often is the person who's committing the crime somebody with schizophrenia, somebody with psychosis? So that already impacts like how somebody relates to themselves. We have a large portion of the homeless population has schizophrenia, a large portion or some type of psychosis or schizophrenia spectrum disorder, and a large portion have issues maintaining employment, issues with disability, and issues with how chronic and severe that disorder is. So that's sort of the impact, the real life impact of culture is that two adolescents experiencing hallucinations, so hearing things that people, or maybe seeing things that people can't hear or see, but they're going to have a huge difference in how they relate to their hallucinations, how they relate to their disorder itself, where in one culture it might be a spiritual phenomena, a spiritual awakening, and in another culture like the United States, it might be a literal death sentence. Because there are actual statistics associated with early death in schizophrenia. So people are more likely to die of medical conditions, oftentimes caused by antipsychotics themselves, and they're more likely to commit suicide, or at least attempt. So that's sort of the big picture. Where you are, what culture you're in, determines even how you're going to relate to those hallucination experiences. So there are actual differences in just the presentation of the experiences. So for example, in Pakistan, people who are, living in Pakistan are more likely to have visual hallucinations than people who are of Pakistan descent but are living in like Britain. And those Pakistani folks in Britain are more likely to have visual hallucinations than their white counterparts in Britain. So location and culture makes a difference. Um, Additionally, the content of it is really, it can vary across generations. Like somebody in 2021 is probably, thinking about the CIA, thinking about microchips, that sort of thing. Maybe vaccinations are causing some anxieties versus somebody 300 years ago, they wouldn't be, paranoid about this because those technologies didn't exist. So one thing the World Health Organization has actually shown is that in developing countries, people with schizophrenia are actually more likely to have a better outcome. And I'll have the article linked in that bit.ly document, but some may say that, like, here in the United States or here in Western society where we treat schizophrenia with antipsychotics, where it's a very stigmatized thing, where it's a medical condition, it's a brain issue, it's a really sort of a defect is oftentimes how it's portrayed. They're going to have a much greater difference than somebody in a culture where it's a spiritual phenomena, it's a spiritual awakening, it's past loved ones communicating. And in some cultures, for example, Vietnamese folks, they may see it as a generational sin, also along with spirituality. So yeah, so those are some of the differences. And I also want to bring in sort of schizophrenia in the United States. So I mentioned earlier about migration, and migration can have an impact, not necessarily in the United States, but we see it in like Britain, where people who immigrate are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, but their offspring, so that second generation, is actually at a higher risk. However, we have to observe the systemic racism, the biases that exist in the psychiatric system, and we also see this in the United States as well. So in the United States, Black folks are 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a very severely stigmatized disorder, than their white counterparts, who are more likely to be diagnosed with a less severe, maybe like mood disorder. This is really impactful because sorry about that noise. Even schizophrenia itself has been used as a way to politically oppress people. So there's a lot tied into just this one word. So yeah, that's sort of what I want to talk about in terms of the culture around it. So now I want to talk about how neighborhood house employees sort of what might be important for folks here to know in terms of schizophrenia. We serve a lot of BIPOC folks, immigrant folks, refugees, and these folks, just given that they're in the United States, are oftentimes at a disadvantage in terms of language, in terms of income, in terms of just citizenship status, and have oftentimes experienced a great deal of trauma. So folks with schizophrenia, race, ethnicity, country of origin, all of those things aside, folks with schizophrenia are already experiencing sort of that marginalization. So they are less likely to access healthcare. Depending on where they are, they're more likely to be stigmatized, and this can keep them out of housing. This can keep them out of education. This can keep them out of employment. Folks with schizophrenia are more likely to actually be cigarette smokers. It's an interesting link, but I think the number somewhere like upwards of 70% of folks with schizophrenia are more likely to be cigarette smokers, which has health consequences of itself. So what I want to sort of open up the conversation in terms of the recovery and how neighborhood house folks might be able to help is having awareness of the risk factors involved in schizophrenia, having awareness of the marginalization that people with schizophrenia experience. So, like, for example, risk factors, there can be a lot. So it's largely genetic disorder, largely, because it doesn't make it's not the entire risk factor. So things like advanced, you'll see it listed as advanced paternal age, but what they're referring to is the sex. So that parent who's assigned male at birth, if the older they are, the higher that risk for schizophrenia goes up in their child. So age 50, for example, folks who conceive children at that age are more likely to have that child develop schizophrenia, even if there's not that family history. So other risk factors can include infections in the parent who's carrying the child. So if they experience infections, additionally, things like just when somebody's born, where they're born, all of these things impact a risk factor, are risk factors for schizophrenia. So, and by risk factors, I mean, if somebody has a risk factors for schizophrenia or for any disorder, it doesn't mean they're going to get it. It just means that they're more likely to get it or to develop it. So those are things to be aware of. You know, do we see in sort of like a cultural aspect are you know, parents in some cultures more likely to be older? That's one thing that we might be aware of. Are those parents who are carrying the children more likely to have infections, experience, you know, poor physical health during the pregnancy? So those are things that maybe we can be aware of as neighborhood house employees, and also know that if, say, a family that you are working with has somebody in the family with schizophrenia, there may be additional services that they may need. So those extra health services, for example, antipsychotics, which are very common treatment for schizophrenia, cause metabolic issues. They can cause weight gain. They can cause diabetes. They can cause a lot of sedation. So folks might sleep a lot, not be very physically active, and thus suffer some health consequences. So it's not all about that diagnosing and, like, you know, providing them medications. That's not the only way to help. I think we as an organization could increase our awareness on reducing stigma and knowing, like, what are some of the health, sort of the health risks associated, or where are the needs in these communities, because we serve marginalized folks, and people with schizophrenia who are also part of marginalized communities are further marginalized. So yeah, that's what I got. I'd like to open it up to folks and see if we can get a conversation going. And here's the bit.ly link if anybody wants to go to it. And you can contact me at the
Do you have any resources for folks who are either like a family member who has schizophrenia or a friend, like ways to support them, ways to also cope, anything like that?
You know, I didn't add those resources onto that document, but I know that there are a lot out there. So I'll add some there. So there are so organizations like NAMI, for example, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, has family to family. So these are support groups for family members of people with mental illness. That might be one place. Support groups across the board. So NAMI, for example, and other organizations have support groups, sometimes not necessarily specific to schizophrenia, but specific to mental illness. So those might be actually good places to go to.
Yeah, the support group that sounds great. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah. Joni, did you have a question?
Yeah, so do you know if schizophrenia is preventable, or if when they take treatment, I hear patients takes like a medication, like injection one per a month or per week, depends. So is reversible, the effects, like hallucinations, or do you know about that? Thank you.
It's not a curable disorder, but it is considered manageable. So some folks with schizophrenia or who have psychotic episodes have a really good recovery, especially, if they're adherent with their treatment, whether that involves medications like antipsychotics or, psychotherapy, that sort of thing, or managing other conditions. And other folks on the other end of the spectrum might need more intensive care, especially if they have what's called treatment resistant schizophrenia. So, and one thing that does make a huge difference is medication adherence. So you mentioned the monthly shots. That's actually one thing that people are using. So let me backtrack a little. Medication adherence. With or without schizophrenia, people are really bad at taking their medication. About half of the medications in the United States are not taken as prescribed. So think of that antibiotic that you were supposed to take for 10 days, but you felt better after day 6, so you stopped taking it. So we also see this in schizophrenia, where people stop taking their medications for a variety of reasons. And that also impacts how manageable their schizophrenia is going to be. So yeah, not curable, but manageable.
What about preventable?
Yeah. So I'm not too familiar with sort of the prevention, but I am going to say, I'm going to talk about the stress diathesis model. So the stress diathesis model, the diathesis is that genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, and that stress is that thing that sort of flicks the switch and triggers that development. So there are a lot of people can be born with that genetic risk factor for schizophrenia if their parent was 50, if their parent had schizophrenia, or they have another family member with schizophrenia, or a twin. So they may have that genetic risk, but really depending on how their life goes, they may not develop it. So things like trauma have a lot to do with it. Early substance use has a lot to do with it. So we might see in adolescents who have who are at risk for developing schizophrenia, using cannabis, can trigger that early development of schizophrenia. So the answer is that it's really complicated because there's a lot that's just going into it, because one, it's really hard to identify who's at risk. So you might be able to identify who's at risk if they have relatives with schizophrenia, but you may not be able to identify other people who are at risk. And they sort of get lost and don't undergo those prevention efforts because nobody's identifying them. So it's a huge conversation. It's a really complicated conversation. But it's a great question. I'd love to dig into that eventually.
I have a question. At what age do the symptoms of schizophrenia appear? Do you happen to know?
Yeah. So schizophrenia has stages. So the first one is that prodromal phase, or prodrome. So it can oftentimes be confused with teenage depression, teenage angst. So that adolescent is maybe withdrawing a little bit more, maybe acting a little bit, odd, in a non-culturally appropriate way. And then depending on their sex assigned at birth, and I'm not too familiar with transgender folks and intersex folks, the literature as a whole just in science as a whole tends to be very like binary and cis. So for folks who are assigned male at birth, you see that sort of risk for schizophrenia happen around 16 to like early 20s, give or take. And for folks who are assigned female at birth, you see that happening a bit later. So in those early 20s to mid 20s. And sometimes there's childhood schizophrenia, although that's arguably a lot more rare. Sometimes it's a lot later onset. But again, that's more rare, but it's really in that like adolescent, young adult phase where people are most at risk.
Thank you.
So Vince, I think you were talking about this with the equitable recovery, but are there trends then of people who move to the US and do with our communities that do have the extra added stresses? Do we see more cases then of immigrants or refugees are in our communities of developing schizophrenia due to the added traumas and stress?
Yeah, so interestingly, the effects of migration can be more seen in people going into Britain than, for example, Australia and the United States, which is interesting. But yeah, there is that added risk. So, some people might say, well, it might be a cultural misinterpretation on behalf of the psychiatrist. So overwhelmingly, psychiatry is not as culturally competent as it should be. So it might be that cultural misinterpretation. It might be racism against folks of color. And it also could be the stress being in a new environment. So there's a lot of things that can contribute to that. But yeah, we do see that effect, and we see it, at least in Britain, for example, we see it more in the second generation, which is actually really interesting.
Listen, also I hear people who have like depression for long time, and they've been like trying to face trauma, like you were explaining, and then they face another trauma, and then another trauma is how they ending with schizophrenia. What would be more like, if you have any more clarification about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have more clarification about that. I do know trauma plays a big role. And for example, in one class that I took in my program, the professor said, oftentimes when I see adolescents or young adults who are diagnosed with psychosis and diagnosed with like sort of these severe mental health conditions, I want to inquire, what's the trauma? What's going on in terms of trauma? But I don't have a good answer for you, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Hey, Vince, do you know if there's any like natural treatment for these people? Like, let's say it's a family from that they believe is a spiritual gift. There's nothing wrong with it, and they want to try some natural medication. Is there any supplements, vitamins, or stuff they could take?
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's stress related. I mean, because can be like from stress escalates to trauma, and then people start having hallucinations and disorganized thoughts, and maybe is there any I don't know, anything that can help them to calm down that is not a prescription from a psychiatric doctor?
Yeah. So I will give the disclaimer, I am not a psychiatrist or versed in like supplements for this or like medications. What I will say is that the World Health Organization has noted that in developing countries where people don't have access to, the westernized medicine that we have here in the United States, such as antipsychotics, and even in indigenous cultures within the United States, there are in those cultures alternative paths to healing from this, alternative paths to relating to the symptoms that the person is experiencing. And Western medicine has a huge disconnect from it. So typically, if somebody has schizophrenia in the United States, they go see a psychiatrist, they will get those antipsychotics. There is research on like how can supplements help specifically negative symptoms, which are not treated by the antipsychotics. So there is research on, are there supplements that can help? Are there alternatives to these antipsychotics, because they can have very severe and sometimes permanent side effects. But there are, accounts of, other cultures using more traditional healing methods that are more in line with their values and more in line with their beliefs. So it's really complicated, and I don't want to give any recommendation just because I'm not, equipped for that. I don't have that education. But
I totally understand. Yeah.
Yeah, but depending on the culture and how that culture views schizophrenia, they may not use antipsychotics to treat schizophrenia. And research itself is exploring how can supplements or other alternative medications help in terms of schizophrenia. Yeah. Did you have a question, Devin?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you happen to have any resources for this. If there was like a child, or yeah, probably like a child who is showing signs of like childhood schizophrenia, which I know is really, really rare. I would imagine that as a little kid, they probably haven't been exposed to as much of the cultural stuff that can kind of shape the way that schizophrenia can present. And so I'm wondering if you know of any resources or places that you could refer people to if they have a young child who's experiencing some of these symptoms, to kind of, I guess early intervention would be the word, to kind of try to start early with an understanding of it that's not so negative, the way that the US tends to perceive it. Does that make sense? I don't know if I worded that clearly.
Yeah. So what I'm, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but say you have a child who is starting to show some sort of signs. Are there, resources that they could access that are not so like stigmatized and, westernized in the way that, we view schizophrenia here? That's sort of
Yeah, like a child who's in the US, but especially maybe a child who's in the US who's from an immigrant family or another culture, or even a child who's not, like even an American child, but who, their parents or other caregivers would like to help them manage this condition in a way that's not so, yeah, so stigmatized and negative, the way that US medicine tends to treat it.
Yeah. I am not aware of any like specific resources for that, but I would encourage seeking like a mental health provider. And it's hard to seek a mental health provider of that culture who's culturally competent, just because we have a lot, we have very few folks due to other reasons. But the best thing might be to seek a mental health provider, versed in like childhood experiences and who is more culturally competent or maybe of that culture. But I actually don't know any resources specifically around that. But starting with that mental health provider who is more familiar
Thank you.
We have time for maybe one or two questions.
Okay. Johnny?
Another question comes to me is the people who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia without having a citizenship in the United States. Do you know if this is a reason the citizenship would be denied for this person?
I actually don't know. That's a great question. Is anybody in the room versed on like immigration qualifications that might be able to step in? I don't think so, but that's a great question. I'm not sure what the rules are around getting citizenship and immigrating to the United States, and whether or not a serious mental illness would disqualify somebody. But Mercedes just posted a resource in the chat. Not for immigration, but for behavioral health. So thank you, Mercedes.
Thank you.
Not seeing any other questions in the chat either. Any final words for us, Vince?
Yeah, a final question, rather. If anybody's comfortable with sharing, when I asked you what you thought of when you heard the word schizophrenia, what were some of the things that you thought of? And maybe you can share if, hearing some more information confirmed or changed perceptions. I'd be interested in hearing.
I have families who they have a member with schizophrenia. So I noticed they have a lot of stress in their life because they have to take care of themselves plus their family with schizophrenia. It's a lot of stress for them to ensure everybody's safe, starting with this person with schizophrenia, and also being immigrants and not speaking English isn't a huge stress for them. So, and when I hear you were presenting this topic, really made me to ensure I will be attending to learn more about. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm happy to stay in touch. If I ever come across any other resources, I'm happy to stay in touch. So if folks don't have my email, it's on the presentation slide. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
One thing that came up for me was I think it was the NPR article of multiple elders being diagnosed with schizophrenia in order to sedate or calm them, which I found alarming, and the whole article is about that, and because they were a danger to others. So when I heard schizophrenia, I thought danger to others, or that's why people were being diagnosed. So
Yeah,
appreciate your enlightenment and information more about schizophrenia.
yeah, definitely. And what you're saying is, it can definitely happen. People being diagnosed with schizophrenia, being faced with forced institutionalization, it's happened as a form of oppression, including political oppression as well.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for cutting anyone off. My name is Justin. I am patient navigator at Seattle World School. I was like really exciting for this, have a meeting like this. It just remind me of my good friend back in high school when I heard the word schizophrenia. Um, he um, he was went to some of the things that you say earlier. He's hearing voices that telling him do things every day, and I remember one day I was wearing a blue jacket, and he was like making a comment on my jacket, and it's sort of like, Justin, I like your brown jacket, and I was like, no, this is blue, and but he's like keep arguing with me like, oh, this is brown, I see brown, why you say blue? And I was like, this is, I did not understand why he's at the time I did not know what's going through his head, and later on um, I find out that he was like on some serious drug abuser. He was like on cannabis and other stuff, and then that is like during the time that he withdraw from using cannabis and other drug and even alcohol. He was drinking underage and start smoking underage, and he got a lot of. I heard a lot of things that he's saying and that not making any sense, and um, it's just like I couldn't understand. Sometimes he's act no he act in different way, and I wish that I know more about schizophrenia earlier and able to get him some help. Um, at that time, I thought like all of us thought that he going to some withdrawal symptom, and he have some symptom that he trying to quit the drug. And later on, he passed away by suicide, and just really sad, and it just remind me of him a lot, what he going through, and I feel like that is like some early side of schizophrenia. And if I knew that he going through like that, I could have be more aggressive, reach out for help, and offer help to him. And at the time we all kid, and we thought he was like Blanks, and he was really into horror movies, and I was like a big fan of horror movies, and I thought he was teasing by telling, oh, I got voice, I got spirit that protect me and telling me things to do, or like angels. And I was like, dude, you're not serious. But it's just sad. It's just sad. It reminds me a lot of him. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
really extremely helpful. Thank you, Vin.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm so sorry to hear about your friend passing. It's absolutely horrible, and it's also not an uncommon experience. And I think you were saying, as an adolescent, you didn't know much about this. So you know, you had limits in what you could help. Others also had limits in, what they could offer. And I think spreading that awareness, spreading that knowledge of like, this is what schizophrenia can look like. Um, there can also be like drug induced psychosis. And additionally, people with schizophrenia can use drugs to cope with their symptoms. So it can go sort of both ways. And I think increasing that awareness, increasing that knowledge around these are the risk factors. This is sort of what it looks like. And, depending on the culture, it might come out as different. They might say it's more of a spirit, they might say it's more of an evil voice. It really depends. So increasing that awareness can help prevent or at least mitigate those sort of circumstances. So thank you, Justin.
The thing that I've been thinking about is similar. Actually, I've known a lot of people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. A lot of times undiagnosed psychotic disorders. I'm trans, and a lot of trans people struggle with psychotic disorders and other mental illness because of a lot of things. And I actually had a friend with schizophrenia commit suicide a couple of weeks ago. And so that, you know, that's on my mind a lot. And part of the reason that she didn't reach out for help towards the end, because she'd talked about considering going to the hospital when she was ideating, and part of why she didn't was past experiences with forced institutionalization and bad hospital experiences, and that's also really common, especially among trans people and other marginalized people. So just that's, and I've had other friends commit suicide who are struggling with, like I said, often undiagnosed psychotic disorders. And so that's, you know, that's what's on my mind. And just thinking about it was really interesting for me to hear about a little bit about the way that some other cultures regard schizophrenia and psychosis. Like I knew a little bit about that and about the ways that the United States is a little bit unique in some of the ways that we treat mental illness here. But I didn't know the piece specifically about people in some other places hearing voices of their ancestors rather than like scary or mean voices. And I think that that's really, really interesting and very reflective of the way that culture shapes the way that our brains are wired and the way that our brains interpret stimulus.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I am so sorry to hear that you've had so much loss among your friends. And yeah, marginalized folks with schizophrenia are especially subject to, you know, bad treatment on behalf of staff in some hospitals and on behalf of other patients as well. So yeah, thank you. Are we good? Are we up with time?
Yeah, we got a minute. Thank you everyone for sharing. Thank you, Justin, Devin, Joni, for all sharing. And Vince, thank you for sharing this topic. And we hope to support the marginalization and the stigma around schizophrenia and get the support out to communities and awareness to support everyone. Thank you all for participating today and joining us and having this conversation, this open conversation. And we will send some slides and an email with Vince's contact information and some of those resources that you mentioned in the bit.ly. We also have the next speaker series in October, at the end of October, on October 28th. Will be hosted by Jasmine Shiloh, and it'll be highlighting awareness for Substance Use Abuse Prevention Month, which is in October. So look out for that email. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
All right. Thank you, folks. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.